idea that comes up every time we bring Syria topic. Many people in Washington, D.C. and in Arab capitals say that Syria is a lost issue now and we should go back to normalization with Assad. The first official step toward normalization with Assad came from King Abdullah of Jordan, and it came briefly after his meeting with President Biden. Do you think this administration is giving a green light to Arab capitals to bring back ties and relations with the Assad regime?
Well, I think before you answer that question, you have to ask, is there any normal to go back to in Syria? I think it's increasingly clear there's no normal state in Syria to return to. There's no putting the clock back to before 2011. Syria is already something different than it was, and it's going to be something different in the future. What people should be spending their energy on is trying to figure out what the new Syria is going to look like. There are different ways that it could go. It could go negative ways, it could go positive ways. I don't think that the United States is fully behind an idea of normalizing relations with the Assad regime. In fact, I think that's very distasteful to the Biden administration as well as to the rest of Washington, D.C. I think you have to look at the bigger picture in Washington. The setting of U.S. policy isn't just done by the executive branch. It's done by Congress as well. Congress actually has a stronger constitutional authority. And so I just spent earlier this year the better part of 7 or 8 months as an advisor in the U.S. Congress. And what I saw was absolutely no change in the attitude of Congress toward the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Still very much an idea in Congress that there needs to be a pressure policy against the Assad regime. So I think this is a year 2021. I think there's been some experimentation with Middle East policy just to see if some different approaches could be tried, such as trying to return to the Iran nuclear agreement. I think what you're seeing as we approach the 1-year mark of the Biden administration is actually the experiments are not working. And there's going to be, I think, in the coming months, something of a pendulum swing back to a pressure policy in a lot of different areas in the Middle East.
Even when you led the Syrian file in Trump administration, we always heard the official remarks on Syria saying that we want a political resolution for Syria. And the only political resolution now is through the UN and Geneva talks. 2 weeks ago, the Syrian opposition delegation met with Assad regime delegation, and the UN report said they don't agree on anything, and Assad is not willing to give up any of his powers or change any of its behaviors. Do you think Geneva talks can take us anywhere? How can a regime like Assad regime being changed by only political talks?
Well, UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which is the basis for the Geneva political process, this calls for a transition of the government in Damascus, a transition to a different kind of government, and one that will be elected, one that will be chosen by the Syrian people themselves. But that's not going to happen by itself. And the UN, so for example, Special Envoy Geir Peterson, he's a very good man, a very skilled diplomat, a long, distinguished career in diplomacy, but he can't do it by himself. He has to have assistance from the international community. There has to be a pressure track in order to make the political process work, for there to be progress on the political track. That's what the Trump administration's approach was. But it wasn't really just the Trump administration. That was a bipartisan consensus policy. And I don't think the attitudes toward the Assad regime have changed very much in Washington to be supportive of a complete change in that policy.
Yes, you talked about the Congress positions, and do you believe today the Congress will make sure that the Caesar Act will be active and no countries will deal with Assad? And what about OFACs? Can, like Jordan, for example, get an OFAC, or other countries in the region?
I think there's still very much a sense in Congress that the Caesar Act is important, and that the intent of Congress needs to be fulfilled, which is that there was meant to be accountability for the Caesar atrocities and other war crimes, other crimes against humanity and war crimes by the Assad regime and its allies. I don't think that expectation in Congress or in the broader U.S. national security community, I don't think that's changed much at all. I don't see evidence for that. So I think the Caesar Act is not going to go anywhere. It will remain right there as, and I think there will be an expectation by Congress that it will be executed. It will be implemented. I think it's going to be very difficult for countries in the region or businesses in the region that want to do business in Damascus. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do that in comfort that they're going to be protected from the Caesar Act, whether it's today or, you could have a Congress that looks somewhat different after 2022. No one knows the way that's going to go. So I think it's going to remain there as an obstacle for whether it's countries or whether it's businesses that would want to get the Caesar Act out of the way so they can go back into Damascus. I don't think they're going to have an easy time with that.
What about exemptions from sanctions to parties inside Syria? Because SDF and also the Syrian opposition believe that it's not fair that they are also sanctioned because of crimes that were committed by Assad. Do you think there is a possibility that SDF or parties in northwest Syria get exemptions from sanctions?
Well, obviously, I'm not the one implementing the Caesar Act anymore, so I'm a private citizen, so I can just offer an observation. The intention of the Caesar Act was to hold the Assad regime and terrorists accountable, and so those communities that are living beyond the control of the regime in liberated territories that either were liberated from the Assad regime or liberated from the Daesh Caliphate, those were not the intended targets of the Caesar Act. So I think it's very unlikely that those communities would be sanctioned under the Caesar Act, whether it's by the current administration or any administration, I think, because the target for the Caesar Act is the regime in Damascus, plain and simple.
Today we heard about a new wave of sanctions against individuals in Lebanon. How do you read these sanctions, and how is it going to impact the scene and developments in Lebanon and Syria as it's connected in a way or another?
I think what you've seen is more than 2 years of a tough stance from Washington toward the issue of corruption and parties that are giving political top cover to Hezbollah and to Assad in Beirut. There has been a running out of patience on the U.S. side for individuals and parties that are doing business with Hezbollah, that are involved in large-scale corruption, and that are trying to facilitate the Assad regime to have influence in Lebanon again. The three names that we saw today, I think, are front and center. They're poster children, so to speak, for that kind of issue. Jamil Sayed, who a close ally of Hezbollah, a close ally of the Assad regime. I mean, he'd already served time in jail for his assistance or his reported role in the murder of Rafiq Hariri. Jihad al-Arab and Danny Khoury were very much, I mean, it's been an open secret for a long time that they were engaged in large-scale corruption and facilitating public corruption with members of the government. So I think this is a trend that's been coming for a long time. I'm not surprised at all. It's a good step. It has to be, the difficulty that the Biden administration is going to have is that these actions there won't be punch from them. There won't be a political effect from them unless they are connected to a broader strategy that will move in a different direction in Lebanon. There has to be, so there needs to be a follow-up. There needs to be a political follow-up. And plain and simple, I think it has to be zero tolerance for parties that are political allies of Hezbollah, political allies of Bashar al-Assad, and parties and individuals that are engaged in the kind of corruption that has destroyed the Lebanese state. It's destroyed state functions. The kind of corruption that has hollowed out the economy, essential services, and so on, which the people have exploded in their anger about for more than 2 years now. And so, so there has to be accountability for both, for the crossing of both of those red lines.
Yes, also Biden administration is having difficulty today in convincing Iran to go back to the nuclear talks. Is this happening because Iran feels that they are now strong and their allies are strong, like Assad, and they want war and they don't want to talk? Or why this is happening?
Well, I think if you look back a year ago, the Iranian regime was in a very difficult position, economically in particular, and was paying the price for its overreach. It was feeling the bite of sanctions. I think what we're seeing is that it was a mistake for the Biden administration to come in and advertise preemptively that it was going to relax that pressure. Probably had they kept the pressure on, they would be in a much better position to try to get some kind of nuclear arrangement with the Iranian regime for whatever it would be worth. But they ceded their leverage up front. They lifted sanctions on a principal proxy force of the Iranian regime, the Houthis in Yemen, and they signaled that they were interested in, they were willing to relax sanctions, and you had, ever since then, it's been essentially 10 months of sanctions evasion without much enforcement.
Yes, but most of the sanctions are still in place on Iran until today. Do you think they are feeling better because China is helping?
Well, it's one thing to have sanctions on the books. It's one thing to have sanctions on paper. It's another thing to enforce them and to actively enforce them. When you're enforcing sanctions, and this is something I learned in working in the White House and the State Department from 2017 to the beginning of this year, the target of your sanctions, especially a really decrepit and authoritarian regime like the Iranian regime or the Assad regime, they will invest a huge amount of energy and resources in evading sanctions. Yeah. So you can cut off one pathway through sanctions. They will immediately be using all of their ministries and all of their proxy forces to try to find a way around.
So you need to always follow up.
And you always have to try to stay one step ahead. I think what's happened this year, 2021, is that the United States stopped trying to stay ahead of the sanctions evasion. That was the role of Brian Hook when he was the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, and Elliot Abrams when he succeeded Brian Hook. They were constantly having to try to stay one step ahead of the Iranian regime. And Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and I, we did that with respect to the Assad regime and its allies. And that enforcement has dropped off this year. And I think that's why you've seen a more relaxed attitude, a more confident attitude from both Tehran and Damascus. It's because the sanctions enforcement has dropped off. But it could be turned back on quite easily. The structure is there. You have good people in both the State Department and the Treasury Department who know how to do that. We have allies overseas, the EU members, for example, the UK, who are willing to go along with us when we choose to enforce sanctions.
Yes, Turkey is a key player in Syria, and President Erdogan is threatening to go into another operation in North Syria today. What do we expect from that? And we know that President Biden promised the Kurds to help them to be there and to stay there. But Can he keep the troops and just send the troops wherever Turkey is trying to go and help the Kurds? Is that possible?
Well, I think you have to back away from it one step and realize that in strategic terms, that would be a confrontation between Turkey and the U.S. In the Syria border zone. That would be something that is absolutely not in the interest of either the United States or Turkey. And I have to think that President Erdogan, if he really gets down to it, would share that view. So I think NATO allies, the U.S. and Turkey, you have to have a strategic dialogue all the time to lay the disagreements and the agreements out on the table and have a comprehensive approach to your alliance. No matter what the issue is, but certainly with this Syria issue, with the northern Iraq issue, that's something that the U.S. and Turkey both need to get back to investing in. They have to invest diplomatic energy, bandwidth, resources in staying as much as possible on the same page in both Syria and Iraq. The tension that you've seen lately along the Syria-Turkey border, I think it's a warning sign to both people in Washington and Ankara that they need to get back to that strategic dialogue. That's something that was there during the Trump administration. It didn't always work well, but it was always there, even when there were real tensions, and there were some very big tensions between the Trump administration and the Turkish government from time to time. But the strategic dialogue channel was always there. I think that's dropped off a little bit this year. The Biden administration's foreign policy focus has been in other issues, but I think trying to stay on the same page with our very important Turkish ally that's too crucial an issue to let other issues force that to fall off the table. I think it's time. This border tension that we've been seeing, it's a signal that it's time for both parties to get back to that strategic dialogue.
Yes. Do you believe it's in the interest of the U.S. National security to stay in northeast Syria, considering what happened in Afghanistan? And many people in this administration are saying we're not putting a lot of troops and we defeated ISIS in northeast Syria and that was a successful partnership. Do you believe in that?
I absolutely do. I believe the U.S. Role, the U.S. military presence in northeast Syria is essential. You still have, the ISIS territorial caliphate is gone. But anyone who's following the Syria issue and the Iraq issue knows that Daesh and other groups like it are still there. They have just become a clandestine terrorist network or an insurgency kind of threat again. But if the U.S. troops were to leave and that support that is going to the local forces, whether that's the SDF or local police forces or the Iraqi forces, if that support were to drop off, that would create a huge opportunity for Daesh or some other groups like that to come back in and fill a vacuum again, which is what you saw in 2013, 2014. And I don't think anyone would think that that would be a good idea to revert to that kind of thing. And then in Afghanistan, yes, the disaster that happened and is still happening in Afghanistan, I think it has to give some pause to anyone who wants to argue that it's time for the U.S. to withdraw from anywhere where we're engaged in an active campaign that is an important issue for U.S. national security. I would also say that the operations that we have in northeast Syria, we're already there in essentially a support role. The presence is small and it's sustainable. So I think we get an awful lot of benefit for what is a very small investment in eastern Syria. I view the same in Iraq as well. I mean, our presence in Iraq, our investment in Iraq is relatively small, but it's quite important. Imagine what would happen if Iraq were to collapse again, like it did in 2014 across those vast territories in the west and the north. Look at what happened last time. I think we shouldn't be repeating this mistake over and over again. When I used to work for many years on Iraq, and I counted that Mosul since 2003 changed hands 8 times. Mm-hmm. We can't afford that again, really. Look what happens every time Mosul changes hands. Mm-hmm. You have an explosion of terrorism, and it will lash out, not just in Iraq, but in the rest of the region and beyond.
How do you see Russia's role in Syria from your experience? Is it possible to talk to Russia to change Assad regime, to pressure Assad regime? Is it possible to work with Russia on implementing stability in northeast Syria and on the borders with Turkey?
The Russians have had a lot of trouble, I think, presenting themselves as a reliable partner in Syria. If you look at the beginning of the Trump administration, the Russians were agreeing to respect de-escalation zones. They then attacked all the de-escalation zones with the Assad regime and with Qasem Soleimani sometimes. They had the reconciliation agreements that General Zorin negotiated in Daraa and some other places, and then they went and didn't live up to their end of the bargain in the reconciliation agreements. Look what happened to the reconciled forces down in Daraa recently. So I don't think anyone should be prepared to take Russian guarantees at face value at this point on the ground. I think people in the Northeast need to think about that very hard, and I know they do actually. The people in the Northeast are looking very hard at what just happened in Daraa and saying, okay, when the Russians come around and they're offering to guarantee to broker some kind of reconciliation between the Northeast and the Assad regime in Damascus, you only have to look to Daraa, and you only have to look before that to the constant bombardment and assaults against the de-escalation zones to see just how far I think you can trust those promises. From the Moscow side, my sense in the dialogue that we constantly had with counterparts in Moscow was that they are very deeply invested in trying to keep one man in the chair in Damascus for a variety of reasons. And they're willing to let the country burn, and they're willing to accept instability and kind of constant churn and warfare to keep one man in the chair.
What do you say today to the Syrian youth who believed in that protesting and going against Assad publicly will change this regime, or at least change the behavior of this regime, and now they see Arab capitals are talking to Assad? They see no strategy almost in the US to change Assad regime. Is it still possible to believe in change in that region?
Well, I think change is already a reality. The Syrian regime of 2011 is gone. It's dead and gone. It's never coming back the way it was. The Assad regime in Damascus is never going to reestablish, reconquer, and impose a stable order according to its terms through all of Syria. It's never going to happen. And I think that's a reality that the regional countries are hoping not to have to face, but they're going to have to face it. They're going to have to face the fact that there's just no putting the genie back in the bottle in Syria. And the same is going to be true in Iran at some point, but that's a separate question. So I think really my advice to my Middle Eastern counterparts for a long time has been they need to be thinking of what their interests in Syria should look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, not right this second. And they need to really, they need to be very careful about making assumptions that the regime in Damascus right now is somehow going to be a partner in reestablishing stability in Syria. It's not going to be, and it's not interested. That regime is not interested in reestablishing stability in Syria. Not in the way that anyone in the region would want.